If you walk through Caracas today, you will see the ruins of what was once the richest country in all of Latin America. You will see crumbling apartment blocks where the elevators stopped working years ago and have never been repaired. You will see supermarket shelves that have been empty for so long that an entire generation has forgotten what abundance looked like. You will see children searching through garbage for scraps of food in a nation that sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. This is not the aftermath of war or natural disaster. This is the aftermath of oil. Venezuela possesses more petroleum than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq and Iran combined, more than any other country on the face of the earth. By every logical calculation, it should be one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Its citizens should enjoy standards of living comparable to Norway or the Gulf states, with gleaming hospitals and world-class universities and infrastructure that would be the envy of Europe. Instead, Venezuela is bankrupt. Its currency is worthless. Its infrastructure is collapsing into rubble. Its people are fleeing by the millions to neighboring countries where they work as day laborers and street vendors, refugees from an oil paradise that became an oil nightmare. They believed oil would make them rich forever. They believed the black gold flowing from Lake Maracaibo was a blessing from Providence that would fund hospitals and schools and highways for generations to come. They did not understand the trap they were walking into with every barrel extracted. They did not see the mechanism that transforms oil wealth into oil debt with mathematical precision. This is the story of why countries with oil are almost always drowning in debt, why the nations blessed with the most valuable commodity on earth are cursed with poverty and dysfunction, why the resource that should create generational prosperity instead creates generational dependency. It is not a story of corruption alone, though corruption certainly plays its part. It is not a story of mismanagement alone, though mismanagement is endemic to these situations. It is a story of a global system designed to extract wealth from the ground and transfer it to distant creditors while leaving the producing nations with nothing but empty fields and unpayable obligations. It is a story of the resource curse, and once you understand how it operates, you will never look at an oil-rich country the same way again. To understand why oil creates debt rather than wealth, we must first understand what happens when a poor country discovers petroleum beneath its soil. The initial reaction is always euphoria and celebration. Politicians announce that the nation's problems are finally solved. Citizens take to the streets to celebrate the end of poverty. International investors arrive on the next flights with briefcases full of projections showing how the oil revenues will transform every aspect of the economy. Everyone believes they have won a geological lottery that will pay dividends forever. This belief is the first step into the trap that will eventually destroy them. The phenomenon was first identified and named by economists studying the Netherlands in the 1960s. The Dutch had discovered enormous natural gas reserves in the North Sea, a windfall that should have enriched the nation beyond measure. The revenues from gas exports flooded into the Dutch economy year after year. The Dutch guilder strengthened dramatically against other currencies as foreign buyers purchased guilders to pay for the gas they needed. And then something unexpected and deeply troubling happened. Dutch manufacturing collapsed almost completely. Factories that had been competitive for decades suddenly could not sell their products abroad because the strong currency made everything they produced too expensive for foreign buyers. Workers who had built things for a living found themselves unemployed and with no prospects. The economists who studied this phenomenon called it Dutch disease, and it would prove to be only the first symptom of a much deeper affliction. The mechanism of Dutch disease works with cruel efficiency in every country it afflicts. When oil revenues pour into a developing economy, they must be converted from dollars into the local currency before they can be spent domestically. This floods the local economy with money and drives up the exchange rate as demand for the local currency increases. A stronger currency makes imports cheaper, which seems like a blessing at first glance. Suddenly, the population can afford foreign goods they could never have purchased before. Imported cars, imported electronics, imported food, imported luxuries of every kind. But the same strong currency that makes imports cheaper also makes exports more expensive for foreign buyers. Local farmers cannot compete with imported food that is now artificially cheap. Local manufacturers cannot compete with imported goods from countries whose currencies have not appreciated. The oil sector grows while every other sector of the economy withers and dies from neglect and competitive pressure. Nigeria discovered oil in the Niger Delta region in 1956 and began exporting in commercial quantities by the early 1960s. Before the oil boom transformed the economy, Nigeria was one of the world's largest exporters of palm oil, ground nuts, cocoa, and rubber. Nigerian agriculture fed the nation and generated substantial export earnings that supported a growing economy. By 1980, after 2 full decades of oil production and soaring prices, Nigerian agriculture had collapsed completely. The country that had once exported food to feed other nations was now importing it to feed its own people. The manufacturing sector that had been growing steadily before the oil boom had virtually disappeared. Nigeria had become entirely dependent on a single commodity whose price it did not control and could not influence. When oil prices fell sharply in 1986, Nigeria's entire economy collapsed with them. The country that sits atop billions of barrels of petroleum went to the International Monetary Fund, begging for emergency loans. The same pattern repeated across the oil-producing world with mechanical precision that should have served as a warning. Venezuela's oil boom in the 1970s destroyed its coffee industry, its cattle ranching, and its nascent manufacturing sector. Indonesia's oil revenues hollowed out its textile and electronics industries that had been the foundation of development. Mexico's petroleum wealth undermined the agricultural economy that had sustained the country and its people for centuries. In each case, the oil revenues created a temporary illusion of prosperity and modernity while systematically destroying the economic foundations that would be desperately needed when the oil finally ran out or the prices collapsed. But Dutch disease was only the beginning of the resource curse. The real destruction came from what the oil revenues did to government finances, to political institutions, and to the fundamental relationship between the state and international creditors. Oil revenues do not merely distort an economy beyond recognition. They transform the very nature of government itself, severing the connection between rulers and ruled. And that transformation opens the door to a debt trap from which few countries have ever managed to escape. The critical transformation occurs in the fundamental relationship between the government and its citizens. In a normal functioning economy, the government depends on taxes collected from the population to fund its operations and ambitions. This dependency creates accountability in ways that cannot be replicated by any other mechanism. If the government wants more revenue, it must create conditions where citizens can earn more money to be taxed. The citizens, in turn, demand services and political representation in exchange for their tax payments. No taxation without representation is not merely a revolutionary slogan. It is a description of the social contract that underlies functional democracies and even reasonably competent authoritarian states throughout history. Oil breaks this social contract completely and permanently. When a government can fund itself entirely from petroleum revenues that flow directly from the ground to the treasury, it no longer needs its citizens for anything productive at all. The population becomes economically irrelevant to the functioning of the state. The government does not need them to work, to produce goods, to innovate new technologies, or to pay taxes that fund government operations. It only needs them to remain quiet and passive while the oil is extracted from beneath their feet and sold on international markets. This is precisely why oil-rich states can afford to be brutal, corrupt, and spectacularly incompetent in ways that would quickly destroy any government dependent on a productive citizenry for its revenues. The oil keeps flowing regardless of how badly the country is governed. This political transformation sets the stage for the debt trap that will eventually consume the country. Oil revenues are inherently volatile. They surge dramatically when international prices are high and collapse just as dramatically when prices fall. But governments that become accustomed to oil wealth do not adjust their spending patterns when prices drop. They have built massive bureaucracies, powerful militaries, and extensive patronage networks that expect to be fed regardless of what is happening in global commodity markets. When oil revenues fall, these governments face an impossible choice: cut spending dramatically and risk political upheaval from the constituencies that depend on state largesse, or borrow money to maintain the illusion of prosperity for another year. They almost always choose to borrow. The international banking system is absolutely delighted to lend to oil-producing governments. Oil in the ground serves as the ultimate collateral for any loan. A country with proven reserves can always borrow against future production because the oil is not going anywhere. The loans come with conditions, of course. They come with interest rates that compound relentlessly over time. They come with requirements to open domestic markets to foreign competition, to privatize state-owned assets at fire sale prices, to implement economic policies favored by the creditors regardless of their effects on the population. But the money is available whenever governments need it, and desperate governments always take it. They take it during every price collapse, every political crisis, every moment when the oil revenues prove insufficient to fund the promises they have made to their populations. Consider the mathematics that ensnare these nations in perpetual indebtedness. When oil prices are high, the government spends lavishly, building prestige projects and expanding public employment to reward supporters and pacify potential critics. The population comes to expect these benefits as permanent entitlements that can never be reduced. When prices fall, the government borrows heavily to maintain spending at levels the population has come to expect. When prices rise again, the government must use a significant portion of revenues simply to service the debt accumulated during the downturn. But political pressures simultaneously demand that spending also increase during boom times to capture the windfall. So the government borrows again, adding to the debt even when revenues are temporarily strong. The cycle continues through boom and bust, and with each complete turn, the debt grows larger while the oil reserves in the ground grow smaller and more expensive to extract. Mexico provides the textbook case study of this trap in full operation. The country discovered massive oil reserves in the 1970s, just as prices were spiking dramatically due to the OPEC embargo. President José López Portillo announced triumphantly that Mexico's only problem now was learning how to manage its sudden abundance. The government borrowed billions of dollars against future oil revenues, using the loans to fund ambitious development programs, expand the state sector, and distribute benefits to politically important constituencies. When oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s, Mexico discovered it could not service the debts it had accumulated during the boom. In August 1982, Mexico announced it would default on $90 billion in foreign obligations. The Latin American debt crisis, which would devastate an entire continent for a decade, had officially begun. The response from international creditors was deeply instructive about how the system actually operates. They did not forgive the debts as might seem appropriate given the circumstances. They restructured them, extending the payment timelines while adding substantial fees and more onerous conditions to the revised agreements. They demanded that Mexico implement structural adjustment programs designed by economists at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in Washington. These programs required Mexico to cut social spending that benefited ordinary people, privatize state enterprises that employed millions of workers, open its domestic markets to foreign competition that would destroy local businesses, and devalue its currency in ways that impoverished anyone who held savings in pesos. The policies caused immense suffering among ordinary Mexicans while ensuring that the foreign creditors would eventually be repaid in full. Mexico spent the entire next decade in economic stagnation, with its oil revenues flowing to banks in New York and London rather than to Mexican development or Mexican citizens. The same pattern destroyed one oil-producing nation after another throughout the developing world. Nigeria borrowed heavily during the oil boom of the 1970s, then defaulted spectacularly in the 1980s, and spent 2 full decades under IMF supervision implementing policies that benefited creditors while impoverishing citizens. Venezuela borrowed against its oil during every boom, defaulted repeatedly during every bust, borrowed again as soon as it could, and ultimately collapsed into the humanitarian catastrophe we witness today. Angola, Ecuador, Algeria, Gabon, Republic of Congo. The list of oil producers that have experienced crippling debt crises reads like a complete roster of the petroleum industry in the developing world. Think about the profound perversity of this outcome for a moment. These countries possess the most valuable commodity in the modern industrial economy. They should have accumulated massive sovereign wealth funds like Norway, building financial reserves during boom times that would sustain prosperity for generations after the oil was depleted. Instead, they accumulated debts that drained their oil wealth to foreign creditors while leaving nothing for their own development. The oil was extracted from their soil, sold on international markets at prevailing prices, and the revenues flowed through their national treasuries just long enough to be redirected to banks headquartered in New York and London and Zurich. The oil made the creditors wealthy beyond imagination. It left the producing countries with empty oil fields and unpayable obligations. The ultimate crisis arrives when a country finally realizes that its oil revenues will never be sufficient to escape the trap it has constructed around itself. The debts have compounded for so many years that servicing them now consumes most or all of the petroleum income the country can generate. The productive economy that might have provided alternative revenues has been systematically destroyed by decades of Dutch disease. The political system that might have implemented painful but necessary reforms has been thoroughly corrupted by decades of oil-funded patronage. The country discovers with horror that it has sold its entire future for a present that has already slipped away into the past. Venezuela reached this terminal point in 2014 when oil prices collapsed from over $100 per barrel to under 50 in a matter of months. The country had been borrowing against expectations of permanently high oil prices for years, assuming the boom would continue indefinitely, because it served everyone's interest to make that assumption. Its debts to China alone exceeded $60 billion, to be repaid not in cash, but in future oil shipments at predetermined prices set when oil was worth twice what it could now command in the market. When prices fell, Venezuela found itself shipping crude oil to China and receiving nothing in return because the shipments were merely servicing the old debts that could never be retired. The oil was flowing out of the country in tanker ships, but no money was flowing back in to replace it. The government faced a set of choices that were all catastrophic in different ways. It could default on its foreign debts and face immediate seizure of its overseas assets, including oil tankers on the high seas and refinery stakes in the United States that were essential to selling Venezuelan heavy crude. It could cut domestic spending to match reduced revenues and face immediate political upheaval from a population accustomed to subsidized food and fuel and employment. It could print money to cover the gap between revenues and obligations and face hyperinflation that would destroy the savings of every citizen in the country. President Nicolas Maduro tried variations of all three strategies simultaneously, unable to commit to any single course of action. The result was the complete collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the exodus of over 7 million people from a country sitting atop 300 billion barrels of petroleum. Nigeria's crisis took a different specific form, but led to similarly devastating outcomes for ordinary citizens. By 2016, oil revenues had fallen by 70% from their peak just a few years earlier. The government could not pay its civil servants who depended on those salaries to feed their families. State governments stopped functioning entirely as funds dried up and could not be replaced. The federal government borrowed from every available source, including local banks and pension funds that were supposed to provide retirement security, even as it defaulted on obligations to foreign contractors who had performed work expecting to be paid. The infrastructure that had been built during the boom years began to collapse rapidly for lack of maintenance. Roads that had been paved crumbled back into dirt tracks. Power plants that had been constructed sat idle for lack of fuel and spare parts. The oil had created the illusion of a modern country with modern infrastructure. The debt revealed that illusion for exactly what it had always been. The human cost of these crises is measured in shortened lives and stunted futures that will persist for generations. When Venezuela's economy collapsed, the healthcare system collapsed along with it. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies like antibiotics and bandages and surgical gloves. Diseases that had been eliminated from the country decades ago returned with devastating force. Infant mortality rose dramatically as women gave birth without proper medical care. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds of body weight during the worst years of the crisis, not from intentional dieting, but from simple lack of food to eat. These were the citizens of a country with more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, starving because the wealth beneath their feet had been systematically transformed into debts, owed to foreign creditors who would be paid before hungry children would be fed. In Nigeria, the crisis manifested differently, but no less destructively for the people who endured it. With government revenues collapsed to a fraction of their former levels, public services that had never been particularly reliable became completely non-existent. Schools closed because there was no money to pay teachers. Police stopped patrolling because there was no money for fuel or salaries. In the vacuum created by state collapse, armed groups emerged to provide their own brutal form of order, funded by kidnapping for ransom and extortion of whatever economic activity remained. The oil-producing Niger Delta region became an active war zone where militants attacked pipelines and production facilities, further disrupting the very output that might have offered some path out of the crisis. The country was actively destroying its own oil infrastructure because the oil had already destroyed its society from the inside out. The resource curse reveals a fundamental truth about the global economic system that economists and policymakers rarely discuss openly in public forums. Wealth does not flow automatically to those who happen to possess valuable resources beneath their soil. It flows to those who control the mechanisms of extraction, financing, trade, and final consumption. The countries that actually own the oil beneath their territory are often the least powerful and least rewarded actors in the entire petroleum economy. They provide the raw material from which value will be created, while others provide the capital, the technology, the shipping, the refining capacity, and the distribution networks. At each step in this long value chain, profits are extracted by parties who bear little of the political instability, environmental destruction, and social costs that oil production imposes on producing countries. The international oil companies perfected this extraction over more than a century of operations in developing countries across every continent. They negotiated agreements with governments that guaranteed their investments would be repaid, and their profits secured regardless of what happened to oil prices or to the producing countries themselves. They structured production-sharing contracts that gave the companies the most profitable early barrels of production and left the host country with the marginal, low-profit production that came later. They transferred profits through complex corporate structures and transfer pricing arrangements designed specifically to minimize taxes paid in producing countries and maximize returns to shareholders in consuming countries. When critics accused them of exploitation, the companies pointed to the billions of dollars nominally flowing into government treasuries, money that those governments then squandered on consumption or borrowed against, compounding the curse with each passing year. The international banking system played an equally central and equally profitable role in transforming oil wealth into oil debt. Banks eagerly lent to oil-producing governments during every boom period, knowing that the loans were secured by resources still in the ground that would eventually be extracted and sold. They charged interest rates that reflected the genuine risk of dealing with unstable governments in turbulent regions, rates that guaranteed substantial profits even if a significant portion of borrowers eventually defaulted on their obligations. When defaults occurred, the banks rarely suffered actual losses. They restructured the debts, adding fees and penalties and extending timelines, ensuring that the producing countries would be paying for decades to come. The debts became perpetual claims on future oil revenues, mortgaging resources that had not yet been extracted to pay for consumption that had already occurred and could never be recovered. The consuming countries benefited from this entire system in ways that their own citizens never recognized or understood. When oil prices spiked during supply disruptions, the revenues flowed to producing countries, but only temporarily and superficially. Those same revenues returned to consuming countries as purchases of imported goods that producing countries no longer made for themselves, as investments in financial assets that produced returns for already wealthy investors, as debt service payments to banks headquartered in New York and London and Frankfurt. The oil wealth circulated through the global economy, creating activity and employment, but it accumulated in the capitals of consuming nations, while producing nations accumulated only debts and depleted reserves that could never be replenished. Consider the lifetime financial flows for a typical oil-producing country caught in this trap. It exports petroleum worth hundreds of billions of dollars over several decades of production. It imports consumer goods, industrial equipment, weapons, and luxury items worth a significant fraction of those total exports. It pays compound interest on debts accumulated during every price downturn over those same decades. It pays dividends and profits to international oil companies that provide the extraction technology and services the country cannot provide for itself. It loses additional value to corruption and capital flight, as its political and economic elites move their personal wealth to safe havens in Switzerland and London and Dubai. By the time the accessible oil is finally exhausted, the country has exported a finite, irreplaceable resource from beneath its soil and received in return a depleted treasury, unpayable debts, a collapsed productive economy, and perhaps some highways and buildings that are already beginning to decay for lack of maintenance. The numbers tell this story with brutal and undeniable clarity. Nigeria has exported over $500 billion worth of oil since achieving independence in 1960. Its current external debt exceeds $40 billion despite numerous restructurings and partial write-offs. Its infrastructure ranks among the worst on the African continent. Over 70% of its population lives in absolute poverty, despite 6 full decades of petroleum exports that should have transformed the nation. The easily accessible oil is largely depleted or approaching depletion. What remains is a country with few other economic resources, a traumatized and impoverished population, and financial obligations it has no realistic hope of ever fully repaying. Venezuela's trajectory is even more devastating when examined in full. The country exported over $1 trillion worth of oil between 1999 and 2014 during the governments of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. It now owes over $150 billion to various creditors around the world, much of it in outright default with no prospect of resolution. Its oil production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day at its peak to under 700,000 today due to lack of investment, lack of maintenance, and lack of technical expertise after foreign companies departed. The remaining reserves consist primarily of extra-heavy crude that requires expensive and sophisticated processing, and the country lacks the capital, the technology, and the credit to develop them. Venezuela has effectively consumed its entire petroleum inheritance and has nothing whatsoever to show for it except ruins, refugees, and debts that will haunt the nation for generations. The resource curse is not truly a curse in any mystical or supernatural sense. It is simply the predictable outcome of a global system designed to transfer wealth from the ground in one part of the world to the financial system in another part, while leaving producing countries with debts instead of development. The system operates exactly as it was designed to operate. It enriches oil companies and their shareholders. It enriches international banks and their depositors. It enriches consuming nations and their populations. It systematically impoverishes the people who happen to live above the petroleum deposits. The curse is not supernatural at all. It is entirely structural, and it continues operating today across the oil-producing world, from the Gulf of Guinea to the Caspian Sea to the tropical forests of South America. The resource curse continues to claim new victims even as the world slowly begins transitioning away from fossil fuels. Countries that discovered oil or gas more recently, like Ghana and Uganda, are walking directly into the same trap that destroyed Venezuela and Nigeria, borrowing against future production to fund current consumption and political priorities. Mozambique discovered massive natural gas reserves and immediately borrowed billions of dollars against future revenues that it now cannot repay, triggering a sovereign debt crisis before the gas had even begun flowing in commercially significant quantities. The pattern is now so predictable that economists can identify which countries will suffer future debt crises simply by tracking announcements of new resource discoveries. The global transition to renewable energy adds an entirely new dimension of urgency to the resource curse. Countries that have not yet escaped the trap face the very real prospect of their petroleum assets becoming worthless before the debts secured against them are fully repaid. If the world successfully reduces carbon emissions as climate science demands, long-term demand for oil will decline permanently. The reserves that serve as collateral for developing country debt will lose their market value. The countries will be left holding the debts, but without the resources to service them. The energy transition, which offers genuine hope for the planet's climate future, threatens to deliver a final devastating blow to nations already crippled and impoverished by the resource curse they never chose. The story of oil-producing debt teaches us that natural resources are not automatically or inherently beneficial to the countries that possess them. Resources create genuine, sustainable wealth only when the institutions exist to manage that wealth wisely and equitably. When the government serves its citizens rather than extracting from them and ignoring their needs. When the financial system is designed to build productive capacity rather than drain it to distant creditors. In the absence of these preconditions, resources become a mechanism of exploitation as efficient and as thorough as any formal colonial administration ever devised, extracting wealth from the periphery and concentrating it in the financial centers of the developed world. Remember that the oil companies and the banks did not actually force these countries to borrow money or squander their revenues. They offered loans that seemed attractive and those loans were accepted by governments that had their own reasons for accepting them. The curse operates through individual choices that seem entirely rational at each specific moment, but lead inexorably to collective catastrophe when accumulated over time. Borrow during the price downturn to maintain political stability. Spend lavishly during the boom to satisfy political pressures. Repeat the cycle until the accumulated debts exceed the value of remaining reserves. The trap is invisible until it has already closed completely around its victims. The rusting oil platforms of Lake Maracaibo and the abandoned pipelines of the Niger Delta are not monuments to bad luck or incompetent management alone. They are the physical evidence of a global system that transforms petroleum deposits into financial obligations, that extracts irreplaceable value from the earth, and deposits it permanently in the accounts of distant creditors. If you understand the resource curse, you understand why discovering oil is often the worst thing that can happen to a developing country and its people. If you understand the resource curse, you understand why the countries with the most valuable resources are so often the most deeply and hopelessly indebted. If you understand the resource curse, you understand the hidden mechanism that transforms blessing into burden and potential wealth into permanent poverty. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic Historian channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.